Okay, very good. Okay, for you folks out in video land, today we're continuing our reading of My Brother's Keeper by Stanislaus Joyce. And of course, our interest is because it's about his brother, his older brother, James Joyce. And we are beginning chapter 3 in the book right now. So without further ado, on we go. Chapter 3, Raw Spring. Some 4 years later, Yeats wrote to my brother in a letter dated December 18th, 1902, quote, "Your technique in verse is very much better than the technique of any young Dublin man I have met during my time. It might have been the work of a young man who lived in an Oxford literary set." My brother was not the product of an Oxford literary set. His cultural background was one of the kind I am endeavoring to describe in some detail. In spite of his seeming equanimity, he suffered from it more deeply than I did because of his attachment to his father and because his mind was haunted by clear visions of what life might be made to yield. In his last years in Belvedere College, he had begun to collect the poems I have already mentioned in a thick, stiff-covered exercise book, the flyleaf which bore the title Moods. It was evidence of the struggle to keep the spirit within him alive in the midst of all-pervading squalor and disintegration. The volume contained some 50 or 60 original lyric poems, some of them rather long, and perhaps half a dozen translations from Latin and French. It was soon followed by another similar volume entitled Shine in Dark, a name borrowed from Whitman's line, "Earth of shine and dark, mottling the tide of the river." Of these very early poems, only 5 remain in complete form, as far as I'm aware. The poem he called the Villanelle of the Temptress, postdated in A Portrait of the Artist, 2 translations quoted by Gorman in his Life of My Brother, a poem quoted in J.F. Burns' Silent Years, and the second song in Chamber Music, originally entitled Commonplace. I remember some longer and more ambitious efforts. One, for example, on the Valkyrie, and another celebrating some joyous festivals of youth. In Orient banners they outfling before the rippled, bearded king. Next reader, please.
I objected to the image because, as I said, it reminded me of a playing card. My brother, a little put out, asked me ironically why I didn't write poetry myself, seeing that I evidently knew everything about everything. In fact, I had made a few abortive attempts. It must have been during my brother's last year at Belvedere College, for in a junior grade we were reading Coppé's Le Luthier de Crémone, and I had secretly attempted to translate the first pages of it into verse. But contemplating the result and comparing it with my brother's verse, I ruefully concluded that I was not a poet. But criticism is a free-for-all. Mine was usually unbounded admiration, but when it was not, my brother either brushed it aside or took it in good part. He tried some half-humorous poems in dialect, too. The dialect consisted mainly of omitting the G of the present participle. Am I foolish to be hoping that you left your windows open to be listening to me moping here and singing, lady mine? The name he put on the serenade was Rebuking, and when he asked me what I thought of it, I told him in schoolboy fashion that I thought it was very nice, but that he ought to change the B to the title in the P, then the B of the title into P. He laughed, but he wrote no more poems in the vernacular style, except the one to the air of Molly Brannigan addressed to Molly Bloom, which has a more genuine ring. This poem is given to Herbert Gorman. Okay, it was in his last year at Belvedere College that he was seized with an overmastering admiration for Ibsen that was like a sudden wind in the sails of a becalmed yacht, like a rudder to a drifting bark. The other influences he had felt, though he had accepted them, had been imposed. This within him been keen and exultant, as if in answer to a call. When Mrs. Patrick Campbell produced Magda Sudermann's Heimat, he went to see it with his parents, probably in a flush period after he had collected his last exhibition. Discussing the play with them the following day, he announced, Joe.
Due to the play is genius breaking out in the home and against the home. You needn't have gone to see it. It's going to happen in your own house. Mrs. Patrick Campbell had at least one listener for whom the play was not just an interesting postprandial pastime. For my brother, the drama had become a thing of supreme importance, what the Mass had been. It would be wrong to dismiss this announcement of his as a mere piece of youthful arrogance. It was at least as much admiration of others as of himself. Ibsen's influence had determined in him a fierce contempt for the ignobility of falsity, and the cause of his inward exultation was not conceit, but his feeling that he belonged to the elect company of those who would mould the conscience of their race. At this time, too, his first ambition to be a dramatist began to take shape. He used to write critiques of every play he went to see, and then compare them with the bored, platitudinous notices of the performances in the newspapers. In his last year, he took part in college theatricals, playing the part of the headmaster in Anstey's farce Vice Versa. He was quite deliberate and self-possessed on the stage, showed a surprising talent for acting, and added an unexpected interest to the part by improvising, to the coach's horror, an excellent imitation of the rector of the college, who was sitting in the front row of the college theatre and seemed to enjoy it as much as his pupils amongst the audience did. Lois.
Before he left Belvedere, however, there was a final clash between Jim and the rector. The summer term at school had come to an end, and the intermediate examinations were due to begin in a day or two. My brother had been entered for the senior grade examinations, which corresponded to the final school leaving examinations in other countries, with the added importance of being conducted directly by the Board of Education. The examinations being, of course, non-denominational, the religious tests, if any, were set by the various colleges themselves. In that year, the rector appointed the day before intermediate examinations for the school examination in Christian doctrine. My brother did not present himself for it. He said he had been studying all day, which, so far as it went, was true. His desertion deeply angered the rector, as I think it was intended to do. My brother had a long memory, especially because my brother was the lead boy of the school, occupying a position equivalent to that of captain of an English school. There was little the rector could do about it except bluster, and that he did. He said that it was an act of rebellion and that he would now not allow my brother to sit for the intermediate examinations at Belvedere, and went off, leaving my brother standing in the quadrangle in outward appearance unmoved. A young Jesuit, Mackerlane, a professor of French, and one of the most competent teachers in the school, whose best pupil my brother was in those years, asked him to wait and followed the rector to his study. Whatever arguments he used, he prevailed upon the rector to allow my brother to sit for the examination, and after some discussion, he was permitted to enter the examination hall late. Next.
The incident coming just at the beginning of his final examinations, together with the angry debate on the rights and the wrongs of it at home, could not but upset my brother. That year, though he again won the special prize for English composition, he did not win an exhibition, but only retained the exhibition he had won in the middle grade. There can have been but little sympathy between the young Jesuit, whose good offices saved the situation, and my brother, for the Jesuit was a 13-stone specimen of muscular Christianity, a first-class gymnast and swimmer, and moreover an Irish language enthusiast. But he was a North of Ireland man, and these Northerners, like the Scotch, respect brains wherever they find them. My brother's 2 prizes for English composition were the reward of a diligent study of style, which he began at school and continued at the university. It consisted in writing essays on subjects of his own choice, though occasionally he asked me to make suggestions. Sometimes these essays were deliberate imitations of Carlyle, Newman, Macaulay, De Quincey, and others. He knew by heart long passages from the stylists he most admired. When Ruskin died, my brother's essay on him, entitled Crown of Wild Olive, was, as the title implies, a studious imitation of the deceased author. As late as our meeting at Salzburg after the First World War in 1928, he could tell me that the only thing that really interested him was style, and I regret to think that then it may have been true. Next, please.
But more indicative of the trend of his thoughts were the sketches that he began to write while still at school, and while we were still living at Windsor Terrace. He called them silhouettes from the first sketch, and though I remember only 2 of them, there may have been a few more. Silhouettes, like the first 3 stories of Dubliners, was written in the first person singular, and described a row of mean little houses along which the narrator passes after nightfall. His attention is attracted by 2 figures in violent agitation on a lower window blind illuminated from within. The burly figure of a man, staggering and threatening with upraised fists, and the small shape-faced figure of a nagging woman. A blow is struck and the light goes out. The narrator waits to see if anything happens afterwards. Yes, the window blind is illuminated again dimly by a candle, no doubt, and a woman's sharp profile appears, accompanied by 2 small heads just above the window ledge of children waked by the noise. The woman's finger is pointed in warning. She is saying, "Don't wake Pa." It was certainly not the kind of story that schoolboys who become writers produce in boyhood. The poetry of noble sentiments, the romantic music, and the dramatic passions with a dominant love theme, which Coulter offered him as a truer poetic insight into the universal problems of human life, did not fit in with life as he knew it. That life was admittedly debased, but he suspected that a less debased life might have its secrets too, and in any case, the life he did not know did not interest him. He accepted the life he knew as he accepted himself, as the rough-hewn matter of his sharp chisel, and just as God had made them both, together with the Amazonian jungle and the foulness thereof, for his delight. He had no doubt that most artists, even the greatest, belied the life they knew, and offered the world a make-believe. Literature, he said, was a parody of life. He declared bitterly that he believed in only 2 things: a woman's love of her child, and a man's love of lies of all possible kinds. And he was determined that his spiritual experience should not be a make-believe. Next, please. Done it. Oh, no, it's not. Tom.
Nevertheless, 2 of the schoolboy productions were what the editors of weekly periodicals called plotty. In fact, one of them, suitably written down to the style of a weekly paper admired by Leopold Bloom, was to be sent to Titbits as a joke and as an experiment in raising the wind. Not wanting to use his own name, he gave it to a young man of his acquaintance who rejoiced in the patronymic of McGinty to send it in under that name. The last time I heard of the story, McGinty was just going to post it to Titbits. It takes so much out of one to put a manuscript in an addressed envelope with a brief covering letter. The plot concerned a man who goes to a masked ball disguised as a prominent Russian diplomat, and when returning home on foot, narrowly escapes assassination at the hands of a nihilist outside the Russian embassy. The would-be assassin is arrested, and the massacre too, as a suspicious character, because in his confusion he forgets about his disguise. But he is rescued by the laughing witch who is soon to be his bride, who, hearing of the attempt, at once guesses what has happened and hastens to the police station to identify him. He had been wakened from a reverie of the laughing witch by the rude shock of the attempt, and the few sentences that describe the reverie were not without grace. A similar magazine story of this kind is attributed in Ulysses to a Mr. Philip Beaufoy of the Playgoers Club, London, who, if I am not greatly mistaken, was, and I hope is still, a real person who had various short stories accepted by Titbits in those years. That Titbits paper was the only one my father used to read for general culture. Next.
The first version of the story was written in imitation of the usual story with the plot when my brother was a schoolboy. The second faked version some 3 or 4 years later. But almost from the beginning, my brother followed his natural bent, which was for the plotless sketch. He came to consider a well-ordered plot in a novel or story as a meretricious literary interest, like the story in a tableau de genre. Suppose is a common word, even in arid geometrical and mathematical problems. It seems to me that if an hypothesis is permissible in the exact sciences, an hypothesis that is a story is all the more permissible to an artist in order to help him clarify the speculations on human life that are striving for expression in his brain. As, however, an hypothesis in logic may be almost purely speculative or have little connection with actual facts, so too a story may have little relation to the brute facts of life. There is no denying that in fiction, even gross unreality is widely accepted. More than he objected to the succession of thrilling incidents carefully worked out so as to keep the interest alive, my brother objected to the literary psychology which he found everywhere in fiction. He said that literature provided men and women with false consciences, literary consciences. Silhouettes was the first faint indication of that coming revolt of his against the hypocrisy of art. The life which he found in novels was not the life that passed before his steel blue eyes and unblinking gaze at home and in the streets of Dublin. The emotions which he found in poetry were not those he found in his own heart, but sumptuous exaggerations to which the poets rose by dint of leading haughty and elaborate lives. These brief, tentative sketches were the beginning of a revolt which was to be as much against literary as against religious ideals. Do you want to go on, Joan?
Okay, his refusal to compromise with the truth had begun. Some of the poorest nations in the world, Armenia, Greece, Ireland, have given birth to some of the world's richest men. The most secretive race in Europe, the Irish, whose literature has never dared to express any but academic ideas on anything, gave birth to one of the most ruthless realists in literature. Idylls he was to write, silent, stony, sit in our hearts. Secrets weary of their tyranny, tyrants willing to be dethroned. That's from Ulysses. By the time my brother was inscribed as a matriculation student of the Royal University of Ireland at University College, an affiliate Jesuit institution, we had moved again to a house with many spacious rooms, gates, and a garden, or rather a neglected field, large enough for me and my school friends to play football in, 5 or 6 to a side. It was a ramshackle building in bad repair, but I should have been glad if we could have stayed there. My father entered as lodger, occupying about half the house, while a big lumbering Ulster man occupied the other half with his wife and child. The relaxing Dublin climate must have sapped the native energy of this man from Belfast, for he was as improvident as my father himself, so that our residence together, though quite amicable, was brief. Poverty and a ruthless landlord put an abrupt end to this attempt at house sharing under a slightly faded orange and green flag. Next, please.
Oh, it's me. We were living there when in April 1900, my brother contributed his article on Ibsen to the Fortnightly Review under the title of Ibsen's New Drama. He was at that time 18 years old and 2 months old, and surely one of the youngest contributors to what was then the most important literary review in England. The publication of the article by the Fortnightly Review in a way approved the discernment of intermediate examiners who had twice conferred the prize for English composition on my brother, and it attracted more attention to him at the university than his refusal about a year before to put his name to the protest against the production of the Countess Kathleen, when the budding mob leaders amongst the students, egged on by a political intriguer, Father Finlay of the Jesuits, were canvassing for signatures. This Jesuit is reported to have said that he was glad they protested for patriotic reasons, since on theologic grounds, the question would have been highly controversial. My brother stood out against the protest alone. It was a mere skirmish, an easily repulsed attempt of the self-appointed leaders of massed intolerance to assert their influence. Yet it showed that my brother was beginning to experience in his own person the truth that the hardy Dr. Stockman had blurred out in An Enemy of the People. That is, the strongest man is he who stands most alone. Incidentally, the article on Ibsen encouraged certain undergraduates and at least one professor to try their luck with the big reviews, and the latter candidly confessed that he had his article sent back to him without comment. Next.
My brother, almost from the first, spoke slightingly of the article, not from false modesty, to which he was not prone, but from a vigilant habit of self-criticism, to which he was strongly inclined. Ibsen wrote through his translator, William Archer, to thank my brother for the article. 1 Vernon Chambers, Southampton Row, W.C., 23rd April, 1900. Dear Sir, I think it will interest you to know that in a letter I had from Henrik Ibsen a day or two ago, he says, quote, I have read, or rather spelt out, a review by Mr. James Joyce in the Fortnightly Review, which is very benevolent, and for which I should greatly like to thank the author, if only I had sufficient knowledge of the language. Yours truly, William Archer. Close on a year later, in a long letter to Ibsen, my brother wrote of his article as hasty and immature, though guiltless of willful stupidity. That was his real opinion of it, often expressed to me, though naturally he was glad of his success. He had written the article rapidly after having read a French translation of When We Dead Awaken, the drama in question, and the proofs of the English translation, which had not yet appeared, were sent to him either by Archer or Heinemann to serve him for the quotations in the article. As journalism, it was, quote, a very smart bit of business, unquote, for a youngster of 18 who by the day was by no means lacking in business capacity. In spite of his admiration for Ibsen, he was greatly amused by a parody of When We Dead Awaken that appeared in Punch His admiration has no need to live a sheltered life. Next, please.
What is still interesting to note in the article is that he admires in Ibsen just those qualities that he himself was to possess in such a high degree: the wonderful calm that seldom condescended to join battle with his enemies, and never allowed conflicting voices to influence his work. He commends Ibsen because he has dispossessed the legitimate hero and chosen average lives in their uncompromising truth for the groundwork of his later plays. He noted that the interest did not depend on action or incident, but on some great ideal conflict of which we become aware as the play proceeds and which rivets our attention. In spite of Ibsen's sense of form and his realism, both rigid and inexorable, his young disciple found in him a fine pity for men and a deep sympathy with the cross purposes and contradictions of life. The article came from the heart without much reflection. He himself was learning sympathy with the cross purposes and contradictions of life in a hard school, and already knew the desolation of those ideal conflicts in which the sufferer is divided against himself, and which, as he said in his letter to Ibsen, must be fought out behind the forehead. Bitter conflicts which, after his mother's death, made his life an ordeal of the spirit. Next, please.
So well as I can recollect, my brother was paid a guinea a page.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you, Joe.
That any better?
That's better.
Okay. Sorry about that. I've replaced my microphone because of the problems with it, and it doesn't seem to work very well. Anyway, so well as I can recollect, my brother was paid a guinea a page for the article, about 12 guineas. I have not the article before me, and went off to London with my father, who was always in high spirits at the prospect of amusing himself and squandering a little windfall. My brother liked to go on these trips with him. For my part, I was glad that my father would be out of the house for almost a week, for almost a whole week. I forget what was the thin excuse for going to London: to present himself unnecessarily to the editor of the Fortnightly Review, Courtney, or to William Archer, perhaps. But the main thing was that my brother saw London, which he probably wanted to see, though he did not say so, and that for a week or so they had a jolly good time. They stayed at a cheap boarding house whose one-eyed landlady my father called Cyclopia. They went to theatres and music halls then in their heyday. My father came back with funny garbled versions of popular songs, and my brother declared that the music hall, not poetry, was a criticism of life. They were invited here and there by a cousin of my father's named O'Connell and some friends of his. My brother was a kind of 5 days wonder. He was not lionized, but there seemed to be some idea that he might be a lion in his cubhood. The Boer War was dragging its slow length out to a still distant close, and my father, like all Irish nationalists, was loquaciously pro-Boer. In the train from Holyhead to London, he had words regarding the war with another traveller, an English jingo, and only my brother's calm dialectic prevented their actually coming to blows. When they visited the Houses of Parliament and were looking at the statue of Cromwell, an elderly gentleman who was standing by thought it fitting to the occasion to hold forth on the greatness of Oliver, concluding with the words, "There are no men like him today." "I'm afraid not," my father said, "except perhaps Paul Kruger. The Bible in one hand and the sword in the other, you know." Joyce?
The Londoner glared at him and walked off, speechless with indignation. And yet my father was proud of his cousin's son, a young stockbroker's clerk who was a lieutenant in the CIB, so much derided by the regular army. He was a tall and handsome young fellow, over 6'3" in height, who had figured on the cover of one of the War Office propaganda publications of the time. My father brought it home to show to his friends, with the inconsequence that must have added to the gaiety of the recording angel's office. Another flitting deposited us at number 8 Royal Terrace, still in the Fairview district. We always moved with great intentions, but each succeeding house had an emptier look. And yet some of the happiest recollections of those years are associated with that house, such as going for a swim with a younger brother, Georgie, in the very early morning in perfect weather. The sea, the summer haze, the silent radiance of the morning were an enchantment under which my memory still lies. Or trespassing in somebody's park, in which there was a little lake or a large pond that had at one end a high bank, as steep as a cliff, and crowned with a spinny and tangled underwood. The place had fewer attractions for its owner than for me, apparently, but there was never anybody about, and I could sit half hidden in the miniature wildwood for hours reading Quo Vadis and the School for Scandal. But generally, I did not like reading in the open air. Next.
In the midst of the sordidness of our family life, my brother endeavored to seize such elusive Eucharistic moments of life, more frequent and more vivid in his case, and express them in songs of his own relief and comfort. For the rest, he was reading eagerly, following some line of impelling interest, mainly at the National Library, every evening till it closed at 10 o'clock. Sometimes when his admiration was aroused, he would send me there too to confirm his opinion of Tolstoy's short stories or Turgenev's novels or A Sportsman's Notebook. He just had to pass his admiration on to somebody. His bookshelves began to be peopled with cheap editions in foreign languages, bought, I must suppose, with whatever was left of the fee he received from the Fortnightly Review. D'Annunzio's plays and poems in white paper covers with red lettering, and many other cheap editions of Italian and foreign dramatists, yellow-backed French editions of Verlaine and Maeterlinck, and translations from the German, Sudermann's Frau Sorge, La Dame en Gris, S. War, L'Indestructible Passé, and Gertschwester, Le Souhait, and George Moore's novels from Vain Fortune to Evelyn Innes, that begins so well, and its just published sequel, Sister Teresa, including Celibates, a good part of which he translated into Italian when he was living at Trieste. He had read everything that Yeats had written in prose or verse, so far as it was procurable, and considered him, with Mangan, the only Irish poet worthy of that high title. I demurred to his valuation of Mangan. I could hardly bring myself to finish Mangan's humorous essays and poems, short as they are, and rhymes such as Bosphorus, with the ugly phrase, "Life has lost its gloss for us," could only be excused, I said, on the plea of the drunkenness of the author. But my brother insisted that at his best, Mangan was a true poet. Later on, he set 2 or 3 of Mangan's poems to pretty airs with appropriate lilt. As for Yeats, though he thought very highly of him as a poet, he laid the blame on Yeats' aestheticism for what he called the man's floating will and wavering, indeterminate personality. Next, please.
Among the older poets, he had progressed from his boyish hero worship of Byron through Shelley to Blake, where my prejudice in favour of sanity prevented me from following him. I could go as far as songs of innocence and songs of experience. Many of the proverbs, I was ready to admit, convinced by their condensed, incisive energy rather than by their real wisdom. But in the mystical books I found nothing but sheer raving, and any mention of Blake's name only elicited jibes from me. It was Yeats' edition of Blake's poems that directed my brother's attention to him. As my brother lectured on Blake at Trieste, the interest he felt in him was clearly no passing enthusiasm. What spiritual affinity could there have been between the uncompromising young realist and the lunatic poet of imagination all compact? Perhaps just that. The mystical Blake was of imagination all compact. And at that time, the imagination was fighting hard for its rights in my brother's soul. It stirred him deeply that in an age of self-satisfied materialism, Blake dared to assert the all-importance of the imagination and to stake his long life on its formation. Next, please.
His attitude towards Shakespeare was vitiated by his cult of Ibsen and by his preference, which, the more he read, grew all the stronger for the artistic tenets of classicism in the drama. Yet he seemed to know by heart many passages in most of the songs of Shakespeare's plays. And for some purpose he had learned them, or for some reason they had remained in his memory. He had attacked Macbeth vigorously for its formal deficiencies in an essay to which Thomas Arnold had assigned a high classification, but it was not the lack of form in Shakespeare's plays that he chiefly objected to. I should say that his aversion sprang from something deeper than a sense of form, and that he disliked in Shakespeare his total lack of faith, or its equivalent, a capacity for an all or nothing devotion to something, regardless of whether it was conducive to his earthly comfort or not. He considered Shakespeare a time server, ever ready to write what he hoped would please, but gifted with a mastery of words that made him the mouthpiece of mankind. When we moved into Royal Terrace, somebody found at the end of the garden 2 books which the children nicknamed the Ash Pit books. One was a songbook, the first pages of which were missing. It contained a large and miscellaneous collection of classical and traditional songs, popular ballads, and many so-called comic songs, the humour of which always remained a vulgar mystery to me. The other was a closely and badly printed, collated edition of the 4 Gospels in a red cloth cover. The former tenants of the house were Protestants, but evidently their Protestantism was animato non troppo. But the little volume was still quite presentable, though the cloth of one cover was detached from the cardboard owing to exposure to the weather. I put it on a shelf and thought no more about it, till an incident at school drew my attention to it again. We were reading Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, and at the lines, "To the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn," the teacher Dempsey asked the boy who was rehearsing them, "Of course, you know the story of Ruth. You have read it in the Bible." The boy nodded and said, "Yes, sir." Next.
But of course he did not know the story and had never seen a Bible at home. Dempsey, for his part, knew that everyone in Dublin and perhaps in Ireland knew then and knows now that in Catholic homes and in Catholic schools, the Bible is never read. In all the years from the time when I was at a nun's school at Blackrock to the time when I left Belvedere, never once was the English Bible or the Douay version or Latin Vulgate opened or read or discussed in or out of class. The very brief and very inadequate excerpts in their prayer books are all the vast majority of Irish Catholics ever know of that compendium of Jewish history and Hebrew literature, which they are supposed to consider of supreme importance. The Catholic Church has its own shrewd reasons for preferring to keep the Bible a sealed book in a dead language. Religions thrive on the ignorance of religion. Dempsey's candid presumption of basic all-round hypocrisy irritated me chiefly because, although the question was not addressed to me, I had let it pass. I afterwards wished I had said out bluntly that I had never opened a Bible, and that I had always been led to regard it as a Protestant book. On my way home, most of these thoughts came pell-mell into my mind, and that evening I took up the ash pit book with the 4 Gospels and began to read them in a desultory fashion at first, instead of studying. And some days later, I read them right through. Next, Joan, please.
The immediate result was the uneasy prompting of doubt. I went to the library to read what the Encyclopedia Britannica had to say about the Gospels. The contrasting opinions of presumably competent people regarding practically everything, authorship, date, place of origin, and even language, of the primitive texts, produced eddies of confusion that settled down into one conviction: that no man in his right mind would buy a house with title deeds like those relating to the edifice of the church. Yet while the Gospels could hardly be considered at all as historical documents relating to events corroborated by contemporary evidence, the various Christian churches had for centuries claimed for them what had never been claimed for authentic historical documents, that is, absolute gospel truth in every detail. In the course of a few months, I lost my first keen interest because I realized that these questions were a matter for scholars and not of general importance. In fact, that they were like the authorship of the Iliad or the Odyssey, a controversial subject of the kind that is a godsend to scholars and the sources of their livelihood. I read Renan's Villa Jesus in the cheap translation published by the Rationalist Press Association, and afterwards at Trieste in French, without being moved either time to enthusiasm for his picnic Christianity or for the Gospel of St. Luke, the most beautiful book in the world. Next, please.
In order to get an idea of the motives underlying the Reformation, I read Luther's Conversations with Melanchthon. But Protestantism gained no proselyte in me. On the contrary, I thought I could discern in Luther fundamentally the mental attitude of some sturdy Irish parish priest, with the body of a metropolitan policeman, a gray, unshaven chin, and no damn nonsense about him. The kind that would say, when speaking of women, sure, marriage is a plaster for that sore, as Luther did. But at least when I read Carlyle's essay on Luther, I was not reading about an unknown man. And when the rector, talking to the class about Protestantism, told us that it was only the shadow of a church, and that Luther left his monastery in order that he could marry a runaway nun, he had one listener who thought almost audibly to himself, I wonder whether the rest of your teaching is as reliable as those 2 statements. A minor inconvenience of my dip into Protestantism was that one evening when I was turning down by the canal at Charlesville Mall on my way to the lending library that was now nearest to us, a small group of boys at the corner began to call after me, scanning the syllables, Martin Luther, Martin Luther. Some junior assistant in the library had thought it was his religious duty to inform his corner boy friends, and perhaps others, of the kind of books I was reading. My talks with my brother were so interminable that almost every other evening I used to accompany him across the city to the National Library, and then turn back home to begin my own homework. On one of these strolls, I announced out of the blue that I would refuse to do my Easter duty. Jim made a half-hearted attempt to dissuade me from my purpose. He asked me, why? Because I don't believe in it, and I'm not going to pretend that I do, said I, excited in spite of myself. You mean that you don't believe in transubstantiation, said Jim, with ironical emphasis on the polysyllable. Yes, said I, that's what I mean. We walked on in silence for a while. Then my brother spoke in a different tone. Don't you think, said he reflectively, choosing his words without haste, there is a certain resemblance between the mystery of the Mass and what I am trying to do? I mean, that I am trying in my poems to give people some kind of intellectual pleasure or spiritual enjoyment by converting the bread of everyday life into something that has a permanent artistic life of its own for their mental, moral, and spiritual uplift, he concluded glibly. Next.
I don't know, I said, sticking to my idea and trying to collect the scattered thoughts of weeks. What symbolic significance the Mass may be made to bear. Your argument seems to me to sidetrack the real question. I know that the host is supposed to be the real body and blood of Christ, that people have been burnt for not believing that it is, and that wars have been fought mainly to suppress people who denied it. Well, I don't believe it. I think it is a literal interpretation of words that were intended figuratively. In any case, it is quite impossible now to sift the ounce of truth from the bushel of legend. What do you consider legendary? Well, the virgin birth, for example. In Roman history, long before Christianity was heard of, the legend was told of the Vestal Virgin, Rhea Silvia, and the alleged father was a god. Ah, that Christian legend is more interesting, said Jim. The Mass on Good Friday seems to me a very good drama. Perhaps. I'm not in the mood to appreciate it. At any rate, I don't feel in any way called upon to sift the legend, even if I were qualified to do so. And I don't feel in any way called upon to accept other people's findings regarding it. To make a long story short, I'm not going to communion anymore because I don't believe that the host is the real body and blood of Christ. And if it is, because I have no appetite, I added angrily. Next, please.
Jim stood stock still in Ballybow Road, raised his chin in the air like a dog about to bay, and gave one of his loud shouts of laughter, and then as we walked along, said, still smiling, "Well, do as you please. I certainly don't want to influence you." I added more calmly that I was satisfied in my mind that communion was a ritual survival of cannibalism. The mention of the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified was not made with the intention of diverting the discussion. I think this is the correct name for this particular Mass, but I have been for so long out of touch with Catholic liturgy that I cannot be sure, and I am too uninterested to ascertain. It is celebrated on Holy Thursday or Good Friday morning and was introduced, I believe, in the 5th or 6th century, no doubt to supplant the dramatic interest of the pagan mysteries which the people still missed. It was a primitive religious drama that my brother valued. It was as a primitive religious drama that my brother valued it so highly. He understood it as the drama of a man who has a perilous mission to fulfill, which he must fulfill even though he knows beforehand that the nearest to his heart will betray him. The chant in words of Judas or Peter on Palm Sunday, "Etsi omnes scandalizati fuerent in te, ego numquam scandalizabor," moved him profoundly. He was habitually a very late riser, but wherever he was, alone in Paris or married in Trieste, he never failed to get up at 5 in all weathers to go to the early morning Mass on Holy Thursday or Good Friday. Resenting my sarcasms at Trieste, he asked me, "You think I'm too orthodox, do you?" "No, but I think you've seen the performance before." "So you have seen Norma before," one of my favorite operas. As for the orthodoxy, I wonder which of us two is more orthodox in his way of living. Next, please.
My mother blamed Jim for my blunt refusal to go to confession or communion, but she was wrong. For in point of time, at least, I refused first. The painful conflict between my mother and my brother originated from my refusal. The tone of the conversation is more faithfully reproduced in Stephen Hero, though he told me of a talk he had with Cranley, which was much vaguer and briefer than the one in A Portrait of the Artist. My father, as usual, behaved like a fool. He declared he was going to write to the college in order to make a public example of me. I looked at him with a concentrated contempt that revives now when I recall it to mind and said, "Oh, don't take it so much to heart." He did not write to the college, either because my mother dissuaded him or, which is much more likely, because his hand was too jiggy from drink. I did not care in any case. I remember that shortly afterwards, I put into an essay some of the cruder skeptical ideas that I habitually confided to my diary. Jim read the essay, as he always did, and tore it up without compliments. He used to read my diary too without asking, "May I?" or even saying, "By your leave." And in the 21st chapter of Stephen Hero, in the conversation with Cranley already cited, there are two borrowings from it. There is a reference to the idea of an ugly, misshapen Jesus. I had heard in many a Christian sermon that Christ, who could have elected to be born the son of a king, chose rather to be born the son of a poor carpenter in order to share the sufferings and hardships of the wretched. My idea was that if he wanted to go the whole hog, he should have chosen to be born an ugly, misshapen little Jew instead of the perfect ideal of manly beauty that Italian painters have given us. A thoroughly reliable source. Health and beauty are more precious gifts than noble birth, and ugliness and deformity the cruelest and most irredeemable of misfortunes. Perhaps he was ugly. A very unprepossessing appearance and the temporary nature of some of his faith cures might partly explain the sudden change of popular feeling between Palm Sunday and Good Friday. The beautiful Jesus of the Catholic Church was evidently invented in order to oust Apollo. That, in any case, was the idea to which a passing allusion is made in Stephen Hero. Moreover, his familiarity with Mary Magdalene and Joanna and the unchaste Susanna, see Luke 8:3, and many others, suggested to me the reflection that Christ was no eunuch priest, an idea of which my brother made somewhat larger use in the first draft and eliminated afterwards.
In the essay on Twelfth Night that Jim tore up, I had maintained, speaking of Sir Toby Belch, and in double detestation of drunkenness and religion, that jolly drunkenness had the highest possible sanction, because at the marriage feast at Cana, when the guests had drunk well and finished all the wine provided for the occasion, so there could be no doubt that some of them were drunk, Jesus, at his mother's request, but rather unwillingly, stood them another one. It was just as well Jim tore the essay up. I had no time to write another. When the teacher, Dempsey, collected the essays on Monday morning, I told him I had none because my brother had torn it up. Sounds like the dog ate my homework. And such was Jim's prestige in the college he had left that Dempsey asked no further questions. My brother's breakaway from Catholicism was due to other motives. He felt it was imperative that he should save his real spiritual life from being overlaid and crushed by a false one that he had outgrown. He believed that poets, in the measure of their gifts and personality, were the repositories of the genuine spiritual life of their race, and that priests were usurpers. He detested falsity and believed in individual freedom more thoroughly than any man I've ever known. There are people, and they are the majority, who outvote us, whose aim in life is to attain stability and security by traveling along the tram lines of reason and experience to the terminus where they have to get off. The more intellectual ones among them endeavor, Procrustes-like, to make life fit a reasoned plan of their own, and willingly sacrifice freedom on the altar of the trinity of order, certainty, and security. Next, please.
They desire an order and stability that life only very rarely yields even to them, and that in any case preclude vast experiences, without which life is all the poorer. The interest that my brother always retained in the philosophy of the Catholic Church sprang from the fact that he considered Catholic philosophy to be the most coherent attempt to establish such an intellectual and material stability. In his own case, however, freedom was a necessity. It was the guiding theme of his life. He accepted its gifts and its perils as he accepted his own personality, as he accepted the life that had produced him. His revolt was a defense of that personality against a system whose encroachments on the plea of obedience ended, like modern totalitarian systems which have copied it, only with the complete cancellation of character. By reaction, his personality was challenging, a rally point for some, a comprehensible cause of jealousy in others. While still a freshman at University College, he declared his intention of making his allotted span an experiment in living. He was determined to be the same in act as he was in his fixed desire, and though he progressed from merciless dogmatism to merciful skepticism, he was temperamentally capable of absolute devotion to a mission to which he felt called by the accident of having been born with talent, even if, as he foresaw from the beginning, that mission should make him an outcast. He understood better than those who were wont to quote the text how inexorably an inner necessity can turn son against father and against mother too, and yet it was inspiring to live with one so young and purposeful. His faith in life sustained him with the joyous certainty that in spite of the squalor that surrounded him, life had some not ignoble meaning. In our world today, serious literature has taken the place of religion. People with liberty of choice go not to the Sunday sermon, but to literature for enlightened understanding of their emotional and intellectual problems. And it answers in parables. My brother held that those parables, for the most part, falsified men, women, and issues, all life, in fact, as it is lived every day, or as it is lived in the imagination, and that at best it was a literature of entertainment, the province of men of letters. Yeats's, Russell's, and the envious Eglinton's insistence on his arrogance is in great part a mistaken judgment. Nor can the mistake have been altogether in good faith, for my brother was outspoken in his lack of esteem for men of letters who toyed with literature. He was far too self-analytical not to be fully aware of his limitations. He considered that he was more gifted than his coevals, but he recognized that Yeats had more poetical talent, and to me he said so repeatedly. What he condemned was their vacillating, compromising attitude towards literature and the host of issues it raised, their willingness to come to terms with the rabblement for the sake of a little peace and success, their literary simile. Falsity of purpose was the literary sin against the Holy Ghost, and he was vigilant to detect it. In his fashion, not unlike Carlyle's ideal of the poet as priest, he watched, though he did not pray. Next, please.
We continued to be fairly regular guests at the Sheehy's, and there Jim met Francis Skeffington, who served him as a model for McCann. The name chosen for its corresponding suggestion of the north of Ireland occurs twice in our family. Once as that of a paternal grandmother, and once as that of my brother's godfather. At the beginning of First World War, Skeffington was arrested as he was going home one evening and shot without trial. The following morning at dawn, though innocent of rebellion or any conspiracy to rebel, the English captain who murdered him was conveniently found to have been insane when he committed the act. At the time I speak of, Skeffington was engaged to the eldest daughter, whom he afterwards married, adding her name to his own, Frances Sheehy Skeffington. He was considered one of the brilliant students of University College and something of a character, because he was a teetotaler, vegetarian, a feminist, and a pacifist. He was short and stocky, had an untrimmed reddish blonde beard, and on all occasions wore a kind of shooting costume, for which reason his fellow students, with flagging wit, called him knickerbockers. Jim and he sometimes acted in charades together, for, barring surnames, Skeffington had some sense of humour, and Jim, as I have said, would keep people in fits of laughter with his dumb show. In one charade that I remember, while Margaret Sheehy was reciting, he was sitting on the floor, half reclining, half resting on one hand, looking up at her with an expression of blank imbecility on his face. Then, following the recitation, his face showed indignation, or astonishment, or happiness, always at an imbecile level. At any point of irony, he would go into a kind of silly giggles, the perfect reproduction of the laugh of a girl friend of ours, and recovering himself to find that the point of irony was long past, that the tone was now pathetic, fall to weeping and blowing his nose loudly. I've seen performances far less funny than this impromptu dumb show, applauded on stage, but except during these light-hearted evenings at the Sheehys, he did not indulge this vein. I find traces of it, however, in certain passages in Ulysses. I have mentioned Jim's good looks, but he was immune from personal vanity. He was by no means so known. His thick hair was usually in disorder, and his clothes often looked as if he had slept in them. During a parlour game called Confession, when asked what was his pet aversion, he answered promptly, soap and water, and I believe it was the truth. In this, too, we were different, for I have become a devotee of the cold bath all my life. Next, please.
One Christmas, Margaret Sheehy produced Cast. An upper room with the folding doors removed was the stage, while a large adjoining room served as an auditorium for the many guests. Margaret Sheehy played Polly with native vivacity, and Jim played Captain Hawtrey without making the part a caricature of military stiffness. The facile audience was generous with applause, for the great advantage of amateur theatricals is that it is not considered proper to criticise until you go home. Most of us spend our middle age readjusting the values misplaced in youth. For one of the minor mysteries of life is that one never knows at the beginning who or what is going to be important. But I always believed in my brother, not as a younger brother who looks up to an elder one. I was far more inclined to be morose than admiring, but because I thought I recognized in him a different type of mind from that of any of the men or adolescents with whom he came in touch. Something direct, keen, unyielding, indifferent to his career. About that time, I began keeping a diary, which is more a record of his doings and comings and goings than of my own. It is true that we were almost always together, for everywhere my brother went, I was sure to go, like a not too amiable little lamb. At the Sheehys, I did not shine. I was sometimes asked to sing, for I had some voice too, but that was all. Sometimes, however, little accidents are revelatory. One of those parlour games that they liked so much and played so often in that family was the School for Scandal. One of the company goes out of the room and the other says spicy things about him. When he is readmitted, he has to guess the author of the scandal. It was Dick Sheehy's turn to go out, a big, stalwart, good-natured fellow whose jokes were sometimes on the heavy side. Maggie Sheehy was collecting the sayings, and when she came to me, I registered that Dick was elephantine in wit and in person. Maggie Sheehy looked at me, surprised out of her usual politeness, and said frankly, "He'll never think you said that." "Well," I replied apologetically, "isn't that the point of the game?" Orla,
I always accompanied Jim to the Saturday evening meetings of the University Literary and Historical Society, where the timid or patriotic debates were almost uniformly depressing to hear. For example, an unblushing time server such as Hugh Boyle Kennedy, afterwards Chief Justice of the Irish Free State, read a paper on the war machine, a state necessity. That was in 1899. A more unwarlike figure than the future Chief Justice it would have been difficult to find in that college. The Father Finlay I have mentioned, forgetful for the nonce of the Spanish officer who was the founder and of the military organization of his order, is said to have suggested that a more appropriate subject for him would have been the sewing machine, a home necessity. My brother's contribution to the debate that followed the reading of the paper was an ironical modification of the 8 Beatitudes to suit the exigencies of the war machine. He spoke with calm vigor like a man who speaks from the heart. To his last days, when he was fleeing before the invading hordes in France, he regarded the European upheaval as one might observe a blizzard or a tornado, and only wondered whether it was still possible to get a book he needed from Paris. And then, too, as a young student, listening to patriotic blatancy, he loathed war. It was evident, moreover, that certain anti-militaristic aspects of the Christian legend still fascinated him. At another debate, Arthur Chanel Cleary, one of those creatures whom the Jesuits use with ill-concealed disfavor, blandly told his audience that though we, the Irish, may sometimes occasionally overstep the mark in convivial drinking, humorous coughing and laughter, we are totally free from a more desolating vice. A moment of silent self-approval and then applause. Joan.
There was at least one young Irishman who was an exception to that consoling generalization and did not care who knew it. At that time, Jim used to frequent music halls and musical comedies, which had names like The Gaiety Girl, The Circus Girl, The Sing-Hully, and having a quick ear, he would strum out their catchy airs on the piano. Among the music hall stars, he showed a preference for damsels of a rather full habit of body and confessed meekly that he liked them sizable. They liked them sizable, prime sausage. Oh, that's from Ulysses. These higher forms of theatrical performance exercised only a passing attraction on him for a year or two, perhaps because a little of them goes a long way. Though after his death, I saw mentioned in some paper of his admiration for a Parisian star who was, however, also a prima donna with a fine voice. In fine, maybe, he found the frank vulgarity of the music hall less offensive than the falsity of most of the legitimate drama of his day. Jones, Pinero, Sutro, Phillips, verse was always a mitigating circumstance, and most of all, Shaw. Next, please.
Well, for school, I studied only the indispensable minimum. I read my brother's English and French books. Maeterlinck was easy, even his so-called philosophical works. Verlaine, not too difficult. But when Jim's correspondent at Vere sent him a Cyrano de Bergerac in its glossy green paper cover, it was heavy going to get through it. I had the satisfaction of finding, however, when Coquelin came to Dublin, that I was able to follow him with little difficulty. I remember quite clearly the vigor with which, squat back to the audience, he hurled defiance at the besiegers of Arras. I remember his clever brother, who played the part of the poetical pastry cook, and I remember Roxanne, but I cannot recollect the actress's name, which is regrettable, for I was half in love with her for long afterwards. Viewed across the gulf that separates the top galley from the footlights, she was romantic, intelligent, beautiful, But for me, the greater part of her fascination consisted in her not being Irish. My brother's university career was undistinguished as regards his studies. He passed his honors examinations regularly without winning any scholarships, but was always in doubt, then and later, as to whether university studies were, after all, worth the trouble. No professor on the teaching staff enjoyed a reputation for anything more than average competence, and the sole preoccupation of the incumbents of the various chairs was to prepare students for the examinations in their subjects. Anything beyond that was considered supererogatory and even a waste of a student's time. Next.
Okay, I think this is a good place to stop. So that's going to be for 5:20. Oh my God. May is flipping by.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I'm going to have to go. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you, Katrina.
Great reading.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And I
Bye,
have to
Katrina.
leave shortly, but I'll stay for a few more minutes.
Okay.
All right. Very good. Let's see what we've got here.
Well, I have some questions about the examinations. Maybe some of you guys who went to school in Ireland can explain this. On page 88 of my version, he's talking about the Board of Education. The examinations being, of course, non-denominational, the religious tests, if any, were set by the various colleges themselves. Huh? I don't know what that means. Is it like national exams? And there's going to be questions about theology, but since different schools teach, it makes no sense to me.
It means there are two sets of exams, one run by the Board of Education and the other by the religious.
Oh.
And they're held on separate day. The day before was the religious.
And depending upon which school you went to, you would take that set of exams.
Yeah, so if you went to a Protestant school, you sat a Protestant version of the exams. And if you went to like a school here in Dublin, the Archbishop of Dublin set but it seemed to be held alongside one another, one day after another, back in Joyce's time. But in my day, it was completely months separated, those exams, and no one took the religious exams seriously. You know, like what happens? You know, you don't get a certificate or anything out of it. You know.
Thank you. Thanks for the explanation, Joe.
Yeah. So the government exam was non-denominational.
Got
it. Yeah, he was good there on talking about religious. He was good on the Bible, Stanislaus, you know, because it's true that most Catholic places never had the Bible and have never seen a Bible, you know.
Yeah.
But that phrase that he uses there, the gospel truth, I mean, we still use that today to tell you the gospel truth, and you go on. Say. So it's amazing the impact, even though there's no Bibles to be seen around.
Yeah, and you're still in court. You swear on the Bible.
You swear on the
Bible. Yes. I remember there was a very fancy copy of the Bible. I think it had been sold by door-to-door hawkers, but it was never read in my home. But there were a number of pages in the front, which were sent to the local convent to show dates of birth, children, and first communion and confirmation. It was like a genealogical record, but the pages with age eventually just stuck together. They had a sort of a gold leaf edge on it, you know.
Yeah.
So basically, the priest told you what was in the Bible in Latin.
Yeah, the Mass was in Latin up to whenever, and he would read pieces of it from the Bible. He'd read the Gospel and the Epistle. The Epistles, two readings that still are read at the Catholic Mass in English now, but it used to be in Latin, yeah.
Mhm.
And that's the only time you come across the
Yeah.
Bible in any form, I think.
And then basically you were instructed in the catechisms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
So the catechism was would be the equivalent, so to speak, of the Protestants reading the Bible,
Yeah.
so to
kind of.
speak. The
It's interesting
exegesis.
that you mentioned the catechism, Duncan. Just recently, my grandson, who's 8 years, was in the back of the car, and he said, "Granddad, I have a question about religion." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Who is God?" And I immediately responded, "God is our Father in heaven, the Lord and creator of all things."
Yeah.
From the catechism, right? Directly from the catechism.
Directly from the catechism.
Saved by the day.
And he didn't ask any further supplementary questions either.
But there
That's
was
exactly
a
what
missile.
the. Mhm.
Sorry,
Sorry, Orla.
I was just saying there was a missal, and it had readings in it, and so it was what people were allowed to read, but whatever, there was no interpretation.
Yeah.
No.
I think the fear was of independent interpretation of anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the reason for the big split right there, as I understand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And did we read that Joyce went to mass every day?
Yes.
No,
Yeah.
I think that was at Easter
no.
time.
Only
Yeah.
around
Yes,
Easter,
at Easter
yeah.
time.
Oh, okay. It was for Easter. Okay. Yeah, it didn't.
Yeah.
That was, yes, later on in life. But it's very interesting in this one here that we get that Stanislaus certainly presents himself as the corrupter of his brother. And that in the beginning, his brother was slightly horrified that Stanislaus was stepping beyond proper boundaries, religious-wise.
I like the way kind of James didn't take the bait. You know, he more or less confused Stanislaus. He got Stanislaus didn't make any headway with him. You know, he was perplexed by his kind of thing. Yeah, he had a strange mind, Joyce, in relation to things. You wouldn't expect that would be his response. You know, the way he kind of began to pick at Stanislaus' arguments about the church and that.
Yeah. Stanislaus is nice the way he writes. You know, he got Mary had a little lamb in there, you know, who followed her around. You know, she followed Jim like a lamb. You know, he's got the illusions that his brother has. Yeah. But it's you feel like you've grown up with these two boys, don't you? After reading a bit of this, you know, clearly their spiritual director should have told their parents to have them in separate bedrooms. There's no point in having these guys talking to one another every day.
Actually,
Lois?
my favorite phrase in this chapter is, "No man in his right mind would buy a house with title deeds like those relating to the edifice of the church."
Oh, I know. Well, I learned something tonight I had been wondering about, and I was planning to look it up, and how, why Francis Skeffington was called Francis Sheehy Skeffington. And I wondered, had he married his sister or something, you know? and it's just that he, he'd a talent for games, except surnames, but not surnames. You know, he's making fun of him. There's one of these some sort of roadside electrical or gas or something device on the street in Rathmines, and it's got a picture of Francis Skeffington, properly presented on it. They're decorating these street furniture things, and it's in walking distance from where he was shot, where he was arrested and also shot. It's interesting, and it just says Skeffington on it.
What were the circumstances of his being shot? He
was arrested.
He was killed. He was killed, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but he was arrested during does anyone else know this better than me? My version of it, he was arrested at Kelly's Corner, where there was a shop being looted. I understand it to be the corner shop there. I was being looted by a crowd, and Skeffington was attempting to dissuade the looters when a passing army patrol made a number of arrests. But the army patrol itself had been on duty at the bridge just above the what do you call that, Portobello Bridge into Rathmines. And they were out of Portobello Barracks, where they were all in a panic because the rumor had spread that the rebels were hanging soldiers from lampposts in the city, which was not happening. And they were kind of trigger happy and nervous. They're a bunch of kids, And the man in charge had been sent back from the front, the officer in charge, because he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, we call it now, shell shock. And he was kind of taken out of medical situation and sent on patrol with these guys, to hold the bridge. They arrived back. I think there were 5 people arrested. And for some reason, this officer decided to shoot the guy the next morning himself. His commanding officer said, "You'll hang for this." So, but it's all a bit blurred. I'm not sure whether anyone knows here, but I don't know if anyone does know. There seems to be more than one person shot the next morning. I don't know whether it's 2 or 5. But not all of them were from the Irish community. There were 3 Unionists arrested as well. So it's very hard to disentangle events. But in the end, the officer who arranged the shooting and did it himself was exonerated on grounds of mental deficiency. So, was but it's interesting, so he's a pacifist. And that situation. And a friend, Joyce, loses one friend to one action of one side, and then he loses Thomas Kettle to the war in Europe as well. These terrible times, as he called them.
And Kettle was married to another of the Sheehy sisters.
Yeah.
I think Mary Sheehy. Yeah.
And is she Emma? Is she Emma in?
Could be.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Is that her diary that's in the Museum of Literature? Is it Mary Sheehy's diary?
Not sure, Joe. Yeah. Must.
Yeah.
Check it out again. Yeah. I don't know.
I must go in there and have a look. Minute handwriting. Yeah. But I wouldn't have liked to have one of their parties with the sort of games they played. Writing smart aleck remarks about your friends, then everyone being revealed.
Is School for Scandal Sheridan?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was a bit confused. It's like, I don't know the play. So is the play School for Scandal similar based on the game?
Oh, I read it.
I read it 50 years ago.
I don't remember.
Because what's amazing is how well read he is.
Yeah.
They're going, would anybody today?
Yeah.
I mean, I know you're all doing Shakespeare on Fridays, but I mean, it's like the amount of stuff he's read, and he's only out of school.
Yeah.
And memorized, Orla. He's got them memorized.
Yeah, and he's analyzing it too,
Yeah,
whether
this
he
is-
likes it or not,
yeah,
or he
right.
thinks the author is deep, like he doesn't think much of Shakespeare.
No.
That's a
And
very
he doesn't like
interesting.
Shaw. What's his objection to Shaw?
I think that he thinks that Shaw is too didactic,
I think so too.
too directly didactic, and you know, has a political point of view.
Yeah.
Didn't like that. But the criticism of Shakespeare is an interesting one. And it seems to me that, you know, going to on page 100 in my book, where it says he, meaning James Joyce, disliked in Shakespeare his total lack of faith or its equivalent, a capacity for an all or nothing devotion. This is what faith means. A capacity for all or nothing devotion to something, regardless of whether it was conducive to his earthly comfort or not. He considered Shakespeare a time server, ever ready to write what he hoped would please. So this is, I find this a fascinating criticism of Shakespeare, and one that I feel he not only overcame later in life, but also kind of transformed himself into later in life.
Yeah, he was very young, like, you know, kind of, so, yeah.
So this seems like that criticism was from more, quote, idealistic days.
Yeah.
Shakespeare did write to plays.
Well, yes.
Mhm.
But he also really did not give any sense of, and this is one of the things I appreciate him, he's not taking sides in terms of religious or what's the word I'm looking for? Theology. You don't get the sense that he's selling you anything.
You're talking about Shakespeare in this case?
Shakespeare, yes. He seems to be totally blank on theology.
Well, you know, he was in a delicate position for one reason, you know, based upon some of the videos that I watched from BBC, thanks to Joe. You know, Shakespeare was from a Catholic family, and he had to tread very, very carefully in those regards. In fact, some of his relatives were actually sought for being traitors. And that Shakespeare, after he moved to London, in terms of most of social life, he stayed very aloof from. He didn't. He spent, according to this, most of his time in the evenings. He literally was in his room at his writing table, writing his next play. And you know, tried to keep himself distant from some of the turmoils and social events of the day.
Well, so you see, like everybody's grandparents were Catholic at the time.
Yeah.
And people like Shakespeare could not be sure, but within the next 5 or 10 years, the Catholics might return to power. And then you wouldn't want to have written a play which sort of, you know, says the Pope is a murderer, you know. So you know, so you know, they were saying this could all change back very easily, and let's not get carried away too much by things. But he attended, I won't go into it, but like there's no record of him regularly attending service.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
This is what happened, Joe, after Henry VIII was succeeded by Mary.
yeah,
You know, Henry VIII introduced the Reformation, but Mary was a fervent Catholic because of her mother, and Catherine of Aragon. And when she came to the throne, she started beheading Protestants all over the place.
yeah, you know,
So they eventually got rid of her.
yeah. Like if you go around Scotland, you see all the little roadside shrines here and there to Protestant martyrs.
Yeah.
And, you know, really sort of, I've sort of got a slightly like a focus on this, you know, but they're so like in that, and you know, I'd say Shakespeare was like, he was a working actor, you know, and he was, of course, he was a pleaser. He didn't want to write the world's best play that only 3 people ever attended. You know, he wanted them all handing over their pennies and at the box office next week. And if there's anything wrong with it, the rest of the crew very quickly told him, you know, say, oh, no, that's not going to work, change it. And they would change there and then.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they call the scripts, the rough notes. So then before the first one, they just worked from rough notes.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like his output was a work in progress.
So this is a real stretch. So in a time of that kind of fervent, you know, rabid politics, is it best not to have a written script? Could that be among the reasons why there were not complete scripts, that you just didn't want the documentation?
Yeah. And that's why they also, if you were an actor, you only got your part. You didn't, only 2 copies would exist at the most of a complete play. So Duncan, you're in Macbeth, you're playing Duncan. Right. Here's Duncan's, and you just get the bits with Duncan. You don't get the bits with Macbeth or Lady Macbeth or anyone of the witches or any of that. And they all, and that's because of the printers. So nobody can assemble them and print them and make money from them. You see?
Yeah, there would be that too, but there would also be, if I'm an actor. So here I'm stretching here. If I'm an actor, I want plausible deniability.
Yeah.
So if they grab me, I say, well, you know, here are my lines. You know, this is what I said. I didn't know what the other people were going to say. You know, it's almost it's a terribly rough and totally crude analogy to the idea of the political cell.
Yeah.
So
it's a good phrase. Your way of building it. I love that phrase, building in deniability to everything you work at. Yeah. But it's kind of interesting to hear this description of Shakespeare. I've never heard that before. Although I read this book, I just don't remember it.
Oh, you mean of Joyce disliking Shakespeare because of his total lack of faith in, or its equivalent?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You know, it's an insight into both of these boys. You know, that you can imagine the way they kicked the ball around themselves when they were talking about things. Right.
Yeah.
One of the I was just thinking there of Shakespeare. One of the things in Shakespeare was that it was boys that played all the women's parts in the plays.
Yeah.
And in some of the plays where the women, the so-called women, were pretending to be boys, you had a boy playing the woman's part, then being a boy again, you know? So all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, it felt nice. It felt nice.
And
has anybody read what he attacked Shakespeare? He attacked Macbeth vigorously for its formal deficiencies.
Well, yeah. But, I think
There is a theory that we do not have the full text of Macbeth, that we may have as little as half of the play. So,
The one we see,
yeah.
I just saw it. The film was here in Cleveland, with Ray Fiennes.
Yeah.
It was quite wonderful.
Oh, it is. It's fantastic.
Very powerful.
I love Macbeth. I don't agree with this at all.
But you said it's only half the play.
Well, I said it's a theory. There are some people who argue that there must be another part that we're missing. And it's quite possible because of the earlier conversation we had. It's kind of a very, I love the whole mythology that surrounds the Scottish play. We must never mention the name, and all this sort of stuff. You break a leg.
And it was quite long enough.
Yeah, well, I'm amazed even in our small group of readers at how much the text vary. We're reading Hamlet right now, and there are significant discrepancies in the text. And I'm sure that everybody's reading from some sort of authorized text. But,
there were all the different folios printed at different times. They all change each other.
Yeah,
are different from each other.
Yeah, and I'll mention once again that one of the interesting things is that the Oxford University Library refused an offer. An offer for the early folios was made to the Oxford Library. They refused it because they said that plays were just trash and not worthy of being in a great university library.
Mm-hmm.
I also found the whole thing on Blake to be quite interesting. And I'll mention for those who may not know that actually it was Yeats who rescued Blake. That Blake was pretty much forgotten until Yeats and I forget Ellis. I think it was Ellis. Brought out a new edition of Blake's major poems. Tom, you got something to say about that?
No, I'm just thinking of Blake there, that Yeats, as you say, and Joyce, they're very interested in Blake, and he's an extraordinary poet, and those two people particularly looked at him, and Joyce lectured on Blake later in Trieste. But Yeats, I didn't know that about Yeats, that he brought him, back to people's attention.
Very much so. That's a really interesting history. Or at least I found it to be fascinating.
Yeah.
And I think it's the University of South Carolina. They have a lot of this material on their website. And then there was this huge falling out between Yeats and I believe it was Ellis was his collaborator. And they had a big falling out over, I believe it was money.
It's interesting the way the amount of energy that James Joyce has for plays and playwrights, and it must have come as a great disappointment to him to basically, I understand he wrote 2 plays, Exiles being the only one we have. The other one he wrote as a young man, he tore up himself. I think we may have passed that, or we're coming to it. But he he tried very hard to be a playwright, and it really didn't work for him. It's interesting, isn't it? You know that.
Yeah, and also a poet. You know, I know he's two kind of collections, but he didn't. So a few nice ones, but yeah. So he. But I think the other thing is, like, as Orla mentioned, the amount of stuff Joyce was reading, like incredible, including Blake and including the foreign writers, and you know, and including having, you know, he could recite probably huge pieces of Shakespeare. You know, like he must have been reading a hell of a lot of his time, apart from doing anything else. Yeah,
just sheer time and effort going into it. I love the phrase somewhere there that was that my brother had a talent for the plotless story.
Yeah.
I mean, there you have it. Three words. Plotless story. We've got Ulysses. And the Wake.
And just I think they're going back to the catechism. You know, I think there was a new catechism brought out in the 1880s or something, around that time, the Catholic catechism. But I think, you know, the episode Ithaca, the Joyce wrote it in this form of catechism, you know, question and answer, you know. Who made the world? God made the world. Who was God? As Dara was saying there,
Is a lie always sinful?
And nothing can excuse it, particularly if it does harmful evil to your neighbor.
So when the Gestapo come looking for the Jewish man you're sheltering and you say you haven't seen him for a month, is that a sin?
And there was also a little temperance catechism that was floating around at some stage that I seem to remember. Did you ever come across that?
No, it's first I've heard of it. It's fantastic. I'd love to have one of those.
We had to take the pioneer.
It's a part of my imagination after 10 pints, you know. But anyway, but I think there was, it's a little
we had to wear our pioneer pins, so a special catechism just didn't arise. One was quite
Oh, stop.
I'll bring up this here, this quote: literature, he, meaning James Joyce, literature, he said, was a parody of life. He declared bitterly that he believed in only two things: a woman's love of her child and a man's love of lies. Of lies of all possible kinds. And he was determined that his spiritual experience should not be a make-believe.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's worth repeating that he was from a very young age interested in writing in the styles of different authors: Carlyle, Newman, Macaulay, De Quincey, etc.
when he's describing the various short stories that James has written. The one where behind a shade he can see a fight taking place between a husband and wife. There's an Agatha Christie story very much like that, a murder on a train, and as the train goes by, you see the people there. And the Russian, the guy who is dressed up like a Russian, that sounds like something out of an O. Henry story. You dress yourself up as a Russian and you get killed because you're a Russian aristocrat that you're really not.
Yeah. And he'd about 90 poems in his notebook that is lost. Juvenilia, presumably. But it goes back to Tom's point about, like, how long would it take you to write 90 poems?
Could we have a competition on what you could use to rhyme with Bosphorus?
What did he rhyme with? I can't remember.
Something gloss for us.
The gloss of us, yeah.
You could do a lobster for us.
Yeah, it has to be for us.
But Stanislaus had a very inquisitive mind himself about things, and he was thinking them out for himself. And but he was fascinated by his brother, and I think
Well, I like the occasional point where Stanislaus just can't stand it anymore, and he has to put in something about himself.
yeah. And he's quite kind of witty and
very, very.
And throwaway remarks, and he's good at summing up a situation from his point of view as well. In lines. Especially, where he's talking about Jesus, the ugly Jesus and so forth.
That was.
Then he says about
go the full distance.
And and he says something. The Italian painters, they would be kind of trusted in what they painted or something like that. You just throw it, and
And the wedding feast at Cana.
Yeah.
And Jesus stood them one. And straight out of the Irish pub scene. Oh, I stood everyone a drink.
Barman, wall to wall.
Yeah, well, yeah. 1 on throwaway, 20 to 1. Where's if the wedding took place in a pub?
He stood him another one.
You can't envisage a wedding that does not take place in a pub.
Just as they were about to leave. Just in passing, did anybody ever read Colm Tóibín's short book, The Testament of Mary?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of, the Cana thing reminded me there of it. And he has a whole kind of, I think he has a passage about that. And it's a very kind of strange book. Yeah.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
So let me bring this up. Should we read Exiles at some point?
Oh, I think everyone should read Exiles at some point, yeah. But,
I presume, Duncan, you mean after this? Or we would read
Well,
it as
in the not too distant future.
Yeah.
No, but we are actually, I think we're about halfway through the reading of this, and I think it's taken us about a month, if I remember correctly. So probably, as we really get towards summer, we'll have completed this reading, and we'll have to make a decision about what will be coming. So,
Joyce in Paris.
Joyce in Paris.
I know, I only because I have the book, but I've only flicked through it.
Okay.
Sounds fascinating.
by whom, Orla?
Is Catherine? What is it? It's the
Catherine
Irish
Flynn.
woman who teaches at the university at
Yeah,
Berkeley.
Catherine Flynn.
Catherine
Flynn.
Flynn. Yes.
Yeah.
I like Catherine Flynn's
Yeah.
voice. I like her voice.
That was the one she brought out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ah.
See, Exiles is it's hard going. It's a hard read. It's like watching your favorite team losing 1-0.
That's what I've heard.
It makes it interesting for that, but maybe it's been nice to have something very uplifting, and then do Exiles.
Okay, and maybe schedule something very uplifting for after Exiles.
Yeah, it is.
So what's chamber music like?
Sorry, Orla.
Sorry, chamber music, the poems.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you can. It's a bit like Exiles.
You'd read it probably a lot quicker. I think there's
Oh yeah. You can get the collected works. I was in a group. We read. Remember Jim Keeley, Tom?
Yeah.
We read the poetry, and when you get through it very quickly, we got all the poems.
Yeah.
Including, the Ode to a Gas Burner or whatever it's called. The humorous stuff.
Gas from a burner. Yeah.
Gas from a burner. Yeah. Why can't I ever find anything when I want it?
You might want to consider something like reading.
We have here.
All our prayers are answered in one volume.
That's upside down, by the way.
Upside down, Joe.
Oh yeah, right. Well, it doesn't make much difference. Poems and exiles.
Poems and exiles. Okay. Well, for those of you who, like myself, will lower yourself to read a digital book every once in a while, I'll still insist that the collected works of James Joyce for what for me I think was 99 cents or $1.99, including all the letters and all the critical essays and political essays.
Yeah.
It's a bargain.
The letters, the letters are.
Yeah, the letters themselves,
they're very good.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we will wind it up for today, but let's
Thank you.
meet again. Anne, I assume you will not be joining us from Dubai.
I'm not going until next Saturday. I'm traveling next Saturday.
Oh, so you're here next week?
Yeah, I'm here for this week.
Oh, okay.
I'm traveling.
This week.
Very good. Well,
So you're going to Dubai? That sounds lovely.
Oh, yeah. Our older son and his wife and dog, they moved there in January.
Oh yeah.
So I'm going to have to check it out. As one would.
And the wife as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Since we had a brief summer and it's been pouring rain all day today, I was just thinking somewhere like that sounds like a lovely break.
Exactly. Just thinking that myself.
I'll try and top that by saying I'm going to Cyprus on Saturday.
You are?
Pardon?
Yeah.
Where are you going?
I'm going to Cyprus, to Paphos. My brother turns 70, so we're going out to celebrate his birthday.
Ah,
Oh, lovely.
excellent.
That's
Excellent.
It'll be
nice.
hot. It'll be hot.
So will you be joining the book club from Cyprus?
I hope so.
So you're going to
Does it-
bring the books with you in the suitcase?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'll use my brother's computer, so I'll be able to tune in that way.
Okay.
Excellent.
That's the
Very
that's
nice.
the ambition at the moment. Whether I
So,
find myself
yeah.
in a local pub or something is another matter.
Well, there you go. One never knows, but one tries.
One try.
Yeah. So I'm going to thank everybody, and
Thank you.
Thank you.
good